Dr. Andersma is an assistant professor at the Wayne State University School of Medicine, and his primary interest has always been in the intersection between substance abuse and parenting. He is presently editor of the peer-reviewed journal Child Maltreatment, and he has a program that's funded by NIH and CDC, which focuses on brief motivational interventions for substance abuse and other child maltreatment risk factors in pregnant postpartum women. We'll get to hear a little bit more about that today. So thank you, Steve, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rima, and thank all of you for coming. I'm delighted to be here. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about. I hope that it's as interesting to you as it is to me, because I just love trying to work out, as tough as all of this is, it's so important that I just love trying to work through this stuff and talk over this tough stuff with all of you. I'm going to be presenting some information that may come as a bit of a surprise to many of you. And I want to urge you to, even though of course I want you to ask questions, I want you to express your skepticism and your doubts, I want you to also try as hard as you can to have an open mind and think carefully about some of the things that we've been doing. This particularly will come as a surprise that the things that we do, and by that I mean all of us, the things that we do in our work, the things that we do as a system, the things that child welfare does to protect children, are not always logical. And there's something called science out there. There's something called evidence that is important as a place to go to in trying to think through just how logical what we are doing is or is not. So I'm going to urge you to think carefully about that and walk with me as we look at some of the research and consider whether it might suggest that there's some things that we could do differently or things that we could do better to protect children. Okay? Now, I've done this talk a few times, and if you're like other audiences, I'm guessing that you're thinking three things right about now. One, you're thinking, you know, in a way, we know that substance abuse is a great risk to children. We know that it's extremely difficult to work with. What could really be said about it? Secondly, you might be thinking about the times you've made tough decisions around this issue and cases that you've had, and wondering whether or not you did the right thing. And third, you might be thinking, how old is this guy? All right, shall we get started? This is the overview. This is essentially what I'd like to cover today with you. I want to talk a little bit about some of the connections between child maltreatment and substance abuse. I'm going to do this briefly. It's a great big literature. There's a lot out there. There's not enough research, but we know it's a danger. So I just want to give you kind of the outline of it and give you some sense of it. I'm going to spend a lot more time on the second point, examining the assumptions behind some of our treatment responses and whether or not those assumptions really hold up when we compare them to what we know from the scientific research. Okay? And then the third piece, I want to talk about some alternative ways of thinking about things that hopefully might be helpful. And they're going to be different, taking a real big picture view here. And a lot of this, some of this is stuff you could take right away and start doing differently. Some of it is stuff that really involves system factors. But I want to present it all to you and see what you think of it and get your feedback on it. So first, some of the connections between substance abuse and child maltreatment. The key thing to notice here is the numbers. Okay, 24.6 million folks in the United States meet criteria for a substance use disorder. And that's not use. That's not I've done it in the past year or the past month. That's meeting criteria for a disorder. Okay. That's a lot of people, and unsurprisingly, some of those people are parents. As many as 10% of children, about 7.5 million children, have one or more parent with a substance use disorder. We're going to talk about this more later, but think briefly about that number and how it fits with child welfare numbers. Speaking broadly now, we don't need exact statistics, although if you know them off the top of your head, I'll be very impressed. How many children get reported to CPS every year in our country? It's about 3 million. Thank you, Dee. How many wind up getting investigated? Maybe 2 million. How many get substantiated, indicated? A little less than 1 million lately. Okay. 7.5 million children with a parent who has a substance use disorder. And in terms of risk, you see a lot of stuff bandied about, and it varies quite a bit based on whether you're looking at folks who've just been referred to child welfare, folks who have been substantiated, folks with children in out-of-home care. In general, it's safe to say that there's a lot of overlap. Okay? There's a lot of substance abuse in folks with child welfare, the folks in the child welfare system. In addition, it seems to be more than just a risk factor. It seems to be a bit of a special risk factor. Some of the research I and others have done has suggested that it's sort of up there in the upper echelon of risk factors. Okay. In one study, for example, it stood out head and shoulders above things like depression, parental stress, poverty. Here's a good example. I like this. This is some work by Rochelle Hansen and colleagues from the National Survey of Adolescents, looking at relations between family environment and violence exposure among youth. They interviewed a lot of adolescents. This is a nationwide random sample with a good number, and looked at a number of forms of violence experiences, including abuse. Okay? Look at some of these. Odds ratios for having any violence exposure of any kind: 3 times greater if there is a family alcohol problem present, 2.4 times greater with a family drug problem, 1.3 times greater if they met criteria for poverty. For intrafamilial physical assault, which occurred in about 10% of youth in this particular sample, family alcohol problem, odds ratio of 2.4, 2 times more likely to have experiences of physical abuse. Family drug problem, 2.4, poverty, 1.4. Okay? 2 to 3 times the risk is what you'll often see as a result of substance abuse in the family. But look at this. Risk is different than certainty, isn't it? And it's important to be clear about this. This is another nationwide survey, happened to be done in Canada by some folks who do great work out there. Okay? Over 8,400 adults who were asked about parental substance abuse experience, their parental substance abuse, and their own experiences of maltreatment. Okay? And look at these rates of severe physical abuse in this sample. Amongst folks who did not have a parent who abused substances, 7.6%. It's consistent with some other surveys like this. Amongst folks who did have a parent with a substance use disorder, 19.8%. That worked out to an odds ratio of 3, similar to what we found in Hansen et al. But look at that, 19.8% is not 100%, is it? And that's important to keep in mind. We got so concerned about substance abuse because, of course, it is something we wouldn't wish on any child, would we? Not in the home, not in the womb, not anywhere. We get so concerned about it, we think about it in terms of being inevitably associated with maltreatment. And perhaps it's not. So given all this, what do we do about it? And I'm going to spend a lot of time on this question. And before I do that, I want to tell you a little story. And it's a sad story, and I'm going to make excuses about why I want to tell this story. I'm going to claim, for example, that it's illustrative. I'm going to claim, for example, that it's interesting. The real reason is I need therapy. And I plan to have this be a therapeutic, cathartic experience for me as I explain to you my wonderful program and how it worked out. This was my first major grant when I was just a wee little lad. It's the Oklahoma Infant Parenting Program. I had the just unbelievably exciting opportunity for a young researcher to develop a program from whole cloth that did what I thought at the time to be absolutely everything right. Okay? The grant was for pretty big money, and I had a relatively small area to cover, so I could do a lot of stuff. So we put in the things that you would normally think you needed. Okay? We had a specialized, this was for mothers of drug-exposed infants, a specialized home visiting team with training in behavioral parent training and in substance abuse. a racially and ethnically diverse specialized home visiting team. We took care of transportation for them. They got free substance abuse treatment from inpatient to intensive outpatient to regular outpatient. In the center, we had behavioral parent training, we had motivational groups, we had domestic violence experts, we had, let's see, I'm losing track, we had family planning, HIV risk reduction, we had a psychiatrist prescribing psychotropic medications to any who needed it, antidepressants to anybody who needed it. We worked really closely, meeting regularly. It was almost a drug court model in some ways, meeting regularly with the child welfare workers and everybody involved with the case to talk about each case in particular, how they were doing. We wrote detailed reports to the court. Thought we'd had everything right. I'm going to ask you a perhaps unusual question. In doing all this, did we in fact have almost everything wrong? Let's see. It was a demonstration program, so we couldn't randomly assign folks to some sort of a control or comparison condition and a treatment, but we did the next best thing. We looked at the association between how much treatment they got, which ranged from none for the folks who dropped out immediately, to going through the entire program successfully. The relationship between dose of treatment received and whether or not there were child welfare re-reports later on. Okay? That's about as well as you can do without random assignment to try to look at whether or not something worked. And you're looking for a dose-response relationship. The more treatment they got, the less likely they were to have a report. Right? Seems logical. And if the treatment worked, those who got more of the treatment wouldn't have as many referrals. And we would overall, hopefully, see very few re-reports in this sample. Anyone have a tissue? Okay, I'm going to need my glasses back on. Up to the final follow-up point, roughly half of folks, and I'm going to, for the sake of the cameras, I'm going to use my mouse to point this out. And I know this is very small and hard to see. This is a survival curve, okay? If I can find my cursor. There it is. Okay. Over here we have cumulative survival. Up here you see this one. Initially nobody had been re-reported to child welfare, right? Because they hadn't had a chance to be re-reported. So that's that axis. It goes from 100% of folks not being re-reported down to 40% of folks being re-reported. Okay, that's the y-axis there, this up and down axis. Down here at the bottom, we have time, and I'm losing my cursor again. We have time, and this is in years. Okay, 1 year, 1.5 years, 2 years, 2.5 years. What you see here is that by 2 years, half of folks had been re-reported to child welfare. Doesn't bode well for my program. But again, the key question is, did the folks who get more treatment do better? No. There was no association between amount of services received and re-reporting. Absolutely none. And we did what we thought was everything right. We did what most of us, I think, would do if you could. If you had unlimited funds. It would be coordinated, it would be comprehensive, it would be evidence-based, you would reduce barriers. So how could this be? I feel a little bit better when I tell this story because I know I'm not alone. Doran Doris, some time ago, did a similar study where they had a fantastic, wonderful, beautiful program for parents in which substance abuse was present and found no association at all between dose of program received and child placement. And then there's Rick Barth. I don't know if any of you know about Richard Barth. He's one of the leading minds out there in terms of child welfare. He's one of my heroes. I really admire his work a great deal. He did something interesting. He has access to some really cool data called NSCAW. They have thousands and thousands of children who have been referred to child welfare services. The short story of what he did is he took all of those cases in which substance abuse was present And from within that great big bunch of cases, he broke them down into two groups that were perfectly matched on every possible risk factor, or at least every risk factor that was measured in this data, and that's an important distinction. The severity of the substance abuse, the amount of depression, the number of kids in the home, prior reports, okay, two groups of families that were similar on almost every variable, except for whether or not they had received treatment for their substance abuse, okay? So we have one group of 219 parents and children who had substance use issues that were identified and who did get treatment, and another group of 219 parents and children who had substance use issues but did not get treatment for it. Okay. Re-reporting rates 18 months later for those in the untreated group, 8.6%. Yeah, okay. But in the treated group, 19.3%, to which my response is, huh? He goes over a lot of reasons for this, and one obvious suggestion is that it's a surveillance effect, that those getting treatment are more likely to be reported by their treatment providers. But, you know, there have been some studies suggesting that surveillance effects are not as great as we once thought they could be, and substance abuse treatment providers just don't tend to report to child welfare very much. Barth concludes this, that although this is not an argument against substance abuse treatment, and I'm not making that either, it is further evidence that we do not have an adequate understanding of what happens when child welfare clients receive services. Truer words may never have been spoken. So this is what I'd like to tackle with you all today. What might explain this? Why did my program fail? Why did Dora and Doris's program fail? Why is Barth getting these wacky, incomprehensible results? We assume some things about treatment and about substance abuse. And tell me if maybe there are other things that ought to be here, but this seemed like a reasonable list of assumptions to me. We assume that you got to have treatment for it, that longer treatment is better than less treatment, that treatment that takes into account the range of risks, and not just one thing, but all the other sorts of risks, the depression, the violence, etc., that's present, is going to be better, that we need to wrap our arms around all of that stuff. That we got to focus on internal change, because if they just change temporarily because we make them, that's not going to last and that's not very good. We assume that they have to admit they have a problem. We assume that a tough approach is necessary, that abstinence is crucial. Methamphetamines are special. And that prenatal exposure, especially to cocaine or methamphetamines, is really bad and demands a vigorous response because it's uniquely damaging to the developing fetus. Some of the things I assumed, anyway, when I first started. And believe me, I understand how tough these issues are because I've come full circle. I started off doing an intensive treatment program and thinking that I had to do kind of everything all at once for everybody, and that was the best way to go. And at this point, I'm approaching women, all women at a given hospital, screening them for substance abuse, and those who screen positive, they work with a computer for 20 minutes. So that's how far along I've come in this. So I understand all sides of this and what it feels like to think, some of this really has to be right, or to think, some of this really can't be right. But let's look at what the evidence says. First, just because I have to talk about some things in a certain way, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I want to do just a quick primer on something called an effect size. The important thing to know is that it's simply a function of the difference between the treated group and a control group. And it ranges in size, theoretically, everywhere from about -4 to about +4, perhaps even more than that. But you never see that. In reality, a typical efficacious program, one that actually works, is going to have an effect size in the positive 0.3 to 0.5 range or so. And that's pretty good. Okay, that's not making a huge difference, but that's pretty good. Okay, that's what we typically see. And it's referred to as a D. It's just the name. It's called the Cohen's d effect size. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Second, a quick primer on meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is when you take a great number of separate studies done by separate investigators in many cases and push them all together, convert all of their outcomes into this Cohen's d statistic, usually, so you can say something that across all the thousands of studies that have been done, Prozac tends to have an effect size of this on depression. Okay? Because we know that results vary with studies, don't we? Some studies show great effects, some show none, some show the opposite. Right? So effect sizes, we're looking for something 0.3 to 0.5 if we're doing pretty well. And a meta-analysis is simply taking a whole bunch of studies, crunching them together, and taking the average effect for those studies. Seem reasonable? Okay. So let's explore that first assumption. Treatment is crucial. You've got to have it. It's interesting, the differences between clinical and court populations and the community. 24.6 million people with a substance use disorder, remember that? How many of those folks wind up in a treatment program? How many of those wind up in court? Just a subsample of them. And the folks that don't wind up in treatment and don't wind up in court look awfully different than the folks that do wind up in treatment and in court. And in fact, about half of people who qualify at one time for a substance use disorder no longer qualify for that substance use disorder 5 years later. And of those folks that go from having had a substance use disorder to not having one, only about 25% of them will have done so via treatment or 12-step groups. Another way to put that is, of every 100 folks who successfully kick a substance use disorder, 75% of them will have done so on their own. Doesn't mean it's easy. Doesn't mean they did it just once. Does mean they did it without professional help. And if you think about it, it actually can make a lot of sense. What is the single toughest, from a statistical standpoint, what's the single toughest drug to kick? I'm sorry? Nicotine, absolutely. Absolutely. Smoking. How many people do you know who have quit smoking? I assume many of you have quit smoking. Was it easy? I am sure it wasn't. Did you have to do it a few times? I'm sure you did. Did you do it via 12 sessions with a professional therapist? Probably not. This one kills me. This absolutely kills me. Okay, this represents 22.2 million people needing treatment for a substance use disorder. Of that 22.2 million people, in the past year, 8% have received any kind of treatment, even just a little bit. Another 5% didn't get treatment but thought they needed it. Okay, and maybe a quarter of them tried to get it. The other 87% didn't get treatment and didn't think they needed it. Unfortunately, this is particularly true around here. This is very hard to read, so I'm going to read it for you. Over on the right, it shows percentage of persons needing treatment but not receiving it as of 2002. The darkest color indicates the highest percentage of folks needing treatment but not getting it. And you'll notice Washington State over here in the black. But what about in foster care? Certainly it's being recognized and treated more thoroughly there, right? These are 1998 data out of California and Illinois. 6.5% of folks were in treatment who had a substance use issue that had been identified. 6.5% of them were in treatment. 41% had failed treatment. 38% never enrolled. 5.5% nobody knows, and 10% completed it. So whether or not it's crucial, most people aren't getting it, and most people don't want it. This is another important one. What does an effect size of 0.3 look like? These are data from a fairly recent meta-analysis of the efficacy of treatments for drug use disorders. 57% of folks who got treatment were successful in staying sober at follow-up. 57%. It's pretty good. 42% of untreated folks were successful. That's what an effect size of 0.3 looks like. That's what we do. The thing to remember is that treatment has, at best, a moderate positive effect. Sometimes we think like and act like these differences are much more extreme than this, don't we? We act like with treatment, it can be near 100 if they really stick with it, and without treatment, they essentially have no chance. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Also, a lot of these studies where we get these effect sizes are based on studies done in university settings. And when we try to move them out into the community, it can be really hard to do so with fidelity and to still get those kinds of effects that we were getting in the original study. One of my favorite examples is from a meta-analysis of multisystemic therapy, which is a fantastic intensive program usually used with delinquent or substance-using adolescents. Effect sizes with university-based therapists, 0.81. That's phenomenal. That's great. That's fantastic. When they get it out in the community, even though they had intensive supervision, intensive training, that effect size drops to 0.26. So in terms of a summary, is treatment really crucial? Is it the only way to get from point A to point B? I'd say these three things. First, treatment has, at best, a moderate positive effect. Don't hear me as saying treatment is worthless or that we don't need it. Absolutely not. Treatment is good. It helps. We should always strive to get it for our parents. But at best, it has a moderate positive effect. There are far more parents needing treatment than we could ever begin to treat using current methods. The vast majority of parents with substance use disorders are unknown to us. And most of those who do change on their own. Well, what about duration? So we'll hear this a lot, won't we? That the longer you keep them in treatment, the better. The longer folks stay, the more likely they are to succeed. And that's true. The longer people stay in treatment, the more likely they are to succeed. But that's a self-selected sample, isn't it? Those are the folks who elect to stay in treatment. What happens when you randomly assign people to long or short treatment? Well, something like this happens. This is from a meta-analysis in 2002. At follow-up points of 3 months or less, a brief treatment of only 1 or 2 sessions, compared to no treatment at all, yielded an effect size of 0.30, what we often see. Between 3 and 6 months, we have an effect size of 0.14. Between 6 and 12 months, 0.24. And then even a year later, 0.13. That's small, but it's statistically significant, and that means something. If you have a brief treatment, 1 or 2 sessions, and you have an effect a year later, that's pretty good. But look at this next column now. That's comparing this brief treatment, 1 or 2 sessions, to a longer active treatment, a typical 12, 18 sessions, for example. If those effect sizes are 0 or near 0, it means there was no difference between the brief and the long. And at only one time point do we see a difference, and even that was not statistically significant. Then there's motivational interviewing, which is a specialized form of a brief intervention that's also been well studied and has a lot of very good data behind it, is one of my particular interests. Look at those effect size for 1, 2, maybe 3 sessions of motivational interviewing for a frequency of alcohol use, peak blood alcohol content, drug use, diet and exercise. So pretty good. Doesn't work so well for smoking, but we won't talk about that. And look at it again in that second column compared to an active treatment. Those effect sizes are near 0, meaning that there was no difference between the long and the brief. So How do we explain that? How do we understand that these brief things can do as well often as these longer things? And I'm not arguing that they always do. There are absolutely cases where longer treatments do better. And in fact, one of the things we know is that the best use of motivational interviewing is as a precursor to a more traditional treatment. That's the best place to use it. We'll talk about that more later, though. What about inpatient treatment? Certainly that's going to work a lot better than outpatient treatment for those severe folks, right? Several reviews found no difference between those getting inpatient treatment and those getting outpatient treatment. A more recent review in 1996 did find some difference, but only in uncontrolled studies. In the randomly assigned controlled studies, there was no difference. Now, how could that be? That was my favorite thing when I was directing that program, was getting them into inpatient treatment. Yes. Okay? How could it not work better? I'm not sure. But this is just substance abuse. What about other stuff? What about interventions to try to affect the way the parent acts or try to enhance the parent-child relationship? This is yet another meta-analysis. Came out in 2003, looking at interventions designed to either increase parental sensitivity to the infant or the child, or that child's attachment to the parent. Okay? Look at this. Programs that were less than 5 sessions had an average effect size of 0.42 for sensitivity and 0.27 for attachment. As we get longer, 5 to 16 sessions, that effect size drops down a little bit over at sensitivity and a lot for attachment. And as we get even longer, greater than 16 sessions, that effect size drops down even further. Yet another assumption. We've got to wrap our arms around everything. You're wasting your time if you're only addressing one risk, because there's so many other risks present, and that'll just sabotage anything you try to do. Because there are lots of them, aren't there? It's easy to feel overwhelmed with all the risks that are present and feel like we've got to do something for everything. Of course, they could never succeed. This is another one of my research heroes, Mark Chaffin. A study in 2004 where he randomly assigned women to either get parent-child interaction therapy, a beautiful, highly efficacious behavioral parent training program, or to standard community care, or to enhanced parent-child interaction therapy where they added substance abuse treatment and treatment for depression and home visits. Here's another survival curve. I'll hop up here and point it out. PCIT only, okay, looks like about 80% had not had a re-report out to about 1,100 days. Enhanced PCIT, we drop all the way down to about 65% without a report. Then with the community group being lower than that. Something about adding those other services made it worse. Why? This is from Linda Valley, who's now at the CDC. She did a meta-analysis on interventions for parent training programs designed to reduce child maltreatment. Total of 77 studies with an average sample size of 111. Overall effect size for programs that were focused on parenting only, 0.66. For interventions that focused on parenting plus other factors, 0.33. And here's Bakerman's Cronenberg et al. Again. Single focus treatments, effect size of 0.45 for sensitivity and 0.34 for attachment. Multifocal treatments, 0.27 for sensitivity and 0.10 for attachment. And this is controlling for multi-problem, multi-risk. Right? That was considered separately. Anybody feeling perplexed about now? There's more, but I promise, as perplexing as it can be, at the end of the day, it's good news. Number one, the truth is always good news. If it's true, it helps us to change and do something different. Second, one of the things that I'm leading up to here is that we have dramatically underestimated the internal ability of folks to change. We've presumed that treatment is necessary, otherwise they're helpless. And that's not the case. We've presumed it takes a whole bunch and a really long time, and that's not the case. Let's talk about something interesting, though. Do they have to change internally, and is that the only kind of change that matters? Contingency management is something that's really big in the drug abuse treatment world, in the drug abuse research world. It's not made its way so much into child welfare. Essentially, it's Skinner. It's operant conditioning. The idea is when we get the behavior that we want, we reinforce it. Not a year later, not 6 months later, but as immediately as we possibly can. Okay. Several recent meta-analyses have made it clear that contingency management, usually using a voucher that's worth goods or services, sometimes it's called prize-based reinforcement, where they pick from a fishbowl, and some of them are winners, some of the little papers they pick are winners, and they get something and some aren't. It's shown, research is suggesting that that's a cheaper way to do it that's just as effective. Recent meta-analysis is suggesting that this works pretty darn well. This seems to stand out amongst other behavioral treatments. And there's no question that once you remove those reinforcers, those behaviors start to come back again. But the question is, are you better off having done it? And there's some reason to think that if you establish this initial period of abstinence using whatever method it might take, that you're better off. So what about a tough approach? How many, when you send folks out in the community for treatment, how many of them are getting a relatively tough approach, kind of a no-nonsense, call them on the carpet, break through the denial, this is the case? How many of your parents are getting that out in the community? Wow, I'm not in Detroit anymore. Really? I'm glad to hear that. That's excellent, because look at this. The association between therapist empathy and client drinking, and this is a slide taken from my third idol of the day, Bill Miller. 6 to 8 months later, the correlation between therapist empathy and drinking outcomes, minus 0.82. That means that the more empathy they got from their counselor, the less they were drinking. 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later. And just in terms of interpretation, correlations go from 0, meaning there's no association whatsoever between the color tie I wear and the weather, or 1, meaning every time I wear a blue tie it rains a lot, or -1, meaning every time I wear a blue tie it never rains. So going from 0 to 1, 1 being the strongest association possible, these are astounding figures. These are astounding. It turns out, if you remember from Psych 101, Carl Rogers, anybody remember him? The guy who said that to be helpful, you needed to be optimistic, empathic, give unconditional positive regard towards the person. Turns out, Carl Rogers was on to something. And this is another study done by Bill Miller, and I'm sorry you can't see his name down very well on the slide, but this is a slide taken from one that Dr. Miller made. The red represents therapists who are low in Rogerian skills, not very empathic, not very optimistic. The yellow, medium in those skills, and the blue, high in those skills. Over there on the left, you see client relapse rates ranging from no relapse up to 40% relapse. And along the bottom there, you see the follow-up point going 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. Look at the difference between the red and the blue. At 6 months, 20% of the clients who had a poor Rogerian skill therapist had relapsed. 5% of those whose therapist was good at those skills had relapsed. All the way out to 24 months, we're still looking at half the relapse rate for clients who are lucky enough to have a therapist who is high in empathy, high in optimism, high in unconditional positive regard. This makes a difference. So it's not just not being confrontational, which is wonderful. I'm glad to see that your folks aren't getting kind of beat up and demeaned out here. That's wonderful news. I think Dr. Rosengren has been busy training everybody in the state or something. I don't know. Because that confrontation can come with a cost. Look at this association. Confrontation, 0.65 is the correlation between the amount of confrontation folks received and the amount of drinking they were doing a year later. The more their therapist confronted them, the more they were drinking. Of course, you do have to admit that you're an addict, right? You have to admit that it's a problem before change can really happen. Not necessarily. There are lots of people who say every day, I'm an addict, I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, and they don't change. And when you think about those community samples we talked about, those 75% of folks that do get over an addiction without changing, without professional help, those folks aren't saying, I came to believe that I was powerless over my addiction. They're saying, it cost too much, and it was killing my liver, and I just grew out of it, and I didn't like what I was doing to my kids, and, I'm just too old for that anyway. So how could this be? All this crazy stuff about brief treatment and single focus. Let me put it to you this way. What on earth must it feel like to lose your children and be told you have to get out of that violent relationship, you have to get over this addiction through intensive treatment, you have to go to parent training once, twice, 3 times a week, whatever, you got to get a job, you got to get a safe and stable house, all at once. Most of us, frankly, would be lucky to start exercising regularly. Okay. So maybe part of what's happening with our well-intentioned multifocal treatments, we don't want to leave them hanging, we don't want to let them fall through the cracks, so we'll try to provide everything. Maybe part of what we're doing is overwhelming and demoralizing them. And maybe success in one thing facilitates success in other things. We know that about substance abuse. If somebody gets treated for a single substance, let's say marijuana, their use of other things like alcohol or maybe their occasional use of cocaine doesn't go up, it goes down in most cases. Success tends to breed success. And one of my favorite examples of this is Beverly Funderburk, who was one of my supervisors in Oklahoma, who taught me how to do parent-child interaction therapy. I and a bunch of other interns were behind a one-way mirror, watching her and learning from her as she did PCIT with the family. The woman came in for her appointment, and we were all waiting eagerly behind the window. And this poor woman had had one of those weeks. You know those weeks that we all have and that our clients certainly have. Okay? Everything that could have gone wrong had gone wrong, and she was stressed, she was upset. And I thought, surely, PCIT is out the window for the day. Dr. Funderburk talked with her, maybe 5 minutes, about everything that had happened, and was very empathic. And then said, well, okay, shall we get started? How can you do that? She needs to process all this, Dr. Funderburk. Well, Dr. Funderburk spent the rest of the session coaching this parent in behavioral play therapy skills, essentially how to play with your child and have a great time with your behaviorally disruptive 3-year-old. By the end of the session, that little boy was banging on the table with his little fist saying, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy." He was so out of his mind thrilled with how much fun he'd had with his mom. And there is no amount of processing that could have had even remotely the effect of that success on that parent. She walked out of there on a cloud. Right. So what's the difference between kaboom, all of this stuff all at once that we know we can't do and it's another failure experience, versus one thing that maybe we can succeed at and then go into other things with this sense of, I can do stuff. And maybe even better, in the process of deciding what one thing to focus on, maybe they have a voice in it. Maybe they have some input into what it is and how they go about it. What makes something a risk? Is it use? If a parent uses cocaine once, is that unacceptable risk? Twice, 3 times, once a month, once a week? What is it? Remember these numbers. I'm repeating them here. 7.5 million children with a parent who had a substance use disorder. 16.1% of persons with substance use or abuse or dependence live with one or more of their children. There's huge numbers. Are all of these children being maltreatment or in immediate danger? Where's the line between something we wouldn't wish on a child and we wish was different, and the point at which we should be offering services and getting involved and trying to encourage them to come in, and the point at which we need child welfare to come in and get a dependency case and really get involved? Where are those lines? Those are hard. I don't know if I have any answers. I can talk about some numbers a bit. These numbers. 119 million people used any alcohol in the past month, some of us included. 54 million people used 5 or more drinks at once in the past month, many of them at the university. 16 million people had heavy use, that is, binging on 5 or more drinks at a time, 5 or more times in the past month. That's a lot. Use of selected illicit drugs, and this is just use. Any drug, 8.2 million in 2004. Or I'm sorry, 8.2% had used in the past month. 6.2% marijuana, 2.7% psychotherapeutics, cocaine, hallucinogens, and here comes methamphetamine. Right? These are big numbers. But here's an important distinction, is that use doesn't automatically mean there's a substance use disorder present. And there's a clear definition for substance use disorder. Abuse is recurrent and significant adverse consequences related to the use. It's not necessarily amount of use. It's the consequences associated with that use and repeated use despite those consequences. And when you add in things like tolerance, withdrawal, or compulsive seeking of it, then you get something defined as substance dependence, which is the closest thing to the lay term of addiction. Okay, there's no scientific definition of addiction. Substance dependence is the closest thing. So let's look at dependence or abuse of specific substances. Alcohol, okay, 18 million. Marijuana, 4 million. Notice how much smaller these numbers are than the use numbers. There are lots of people using all of these things who do not qualify for substance abuse or substance dependence. I like this one. How often are people using stuff without having a substance use disorder? This is people without any disorder at all. On average, they're using marijuana about 60 days in the past year. Folks who use marijuana but do not have a disorder. Alcohol, about 60 days. Stimulants, 40 days. Heroin, 30 days. Cocaine, maybe 20 days. As compared to folks with a disorder, maybe twice to 3 times that much across the board. So the point here is that the mere fact of use does not come close to telling us that there's an abuse or dependence situation. And those are where the risks really might come across. Okay, remember there's a 2 to 3-fold increase in risk, which does not mean that maltreatment is absolute in any of these cases. Any comments, questions, thoughts? Anybody at all? Yes, ma'am, please.
My question is, in the child welfare system, we have the person who has the biggest impact on our clients often is the state social worker. So can you talk a little bit about the role of the state social worker in terms, can you use that interchangeably with the therapist? Or do you think that their training and their approach with a client has less of a consequence than the therapist?
Help me understand what you mean by state social worker. That's not a term
The child
I'm familiar
welfare
with.
social worker?
Oh, the child welfare social worker.
Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of like therapists, when I talked about therapist characteristics, like the Rogerian skills,
yeah,
et cetera.
Because in family treatment court, where I supervise child advocates, we are always talking about how important it is to approach clients positively and in a strengths-based way, so that we are, have positive client engagement and speak of them positively.
Yep.
And sometimes we hear from professional social workers that they believe that the accountability really lies with the client themselves. So it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about that for child welfare social workers.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies looking specifically at the association, for example, between empathy and optimism and outcomes for child welfare workers or state social workers. I'd be surprised if it was different. I would expect it to look similar. That those kinds of factors across a lot of different sorts of helping relationships seem to be important. I really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you very much.